It begins in silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels wrong, heavy, pressing, as if the world itself has stopped breathing. The city is still standing, but something inside it has collapsed. Streetlights are dead. Traffic signals hang uselessly over empty intersections. Shops are open but not functioning. Doors creak in the wind. Shelves inside are stripped bare, as if time itself reached in and removed everything that mattered. There are no crowds, no noise, only scattered movement, people walking, searching, calculating. And in the middle of it all, a man walks forward slowly, carefully. In his hand he carries something heavy, something that, until recently, meant security, power, control. Gold, solid, cold, untouched by time. He tightens his grip around it, as if holding onto certainty itself. Ahead of him, there's a table, rough wood, uneven legs, nothing remarkable, except for what sits on top of it. Bread, not packaged, not branded, just simple, imperfect, real. The kind that smells alive. The kind that feels like survival. Behind the table sits a woman. She isn't panicking. She isn't shouting. She's watching. Not the man, not the street, but everything, like someone who has already understood what others are still trying to figure out. The man steps forward. He places the gold on the table. The sound echoes sharp, metallic, unnatural, in a world that no longer runs on metal. For a moment, nothing happens. The woman doesn't react. She doesn't even look down. The man hesitates. "This is gold," he says. There is a pause, then slowly, she looks at him. Not with confusion, not with interest, but with something far more unsettling. "Indifference. Not here," she replies. And in that moment, something breaks. Not the system, not the economy, but the idea of value itself. Because what he's holding, what he believed, was universal, timeless, unquestionable, has just become irrelevant. This is where the illusion begins to crack. We are taught to believe that value is stable, that wealth is something you can store, accumulate, protect. Numbers in a bank account, assets in a portfolio, precious metals in your hand. We are told that these things represent security, that they transcend time, that no matter what happens, they will hold. But all of that depends on something invisible, something fragile, something most people never think about. Trust in systems, trust in institutions, trust in institutions, trust in other people agreeing that something has value. Gold is not powerful. Because of what it is powerful because of what people believe about it, and belief is conditional. Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow and something feels off. Your phone has no signal, no internet. You try to check your bank account, it won't load. ATMs are offline. Stores are open. But nothing is being sold because nothing is being delivered. Fuel stations are closed. Supply trucks have stopped coming, and slowly realization spreads, not through announcements, not through news, but through absence. The absence of function. The absence of certainty. At first, people wait, because that's what systems train us to do. Wait for things to return to normal. But this time, normal doesn't return, and as the hours pass, something shifts, not externally. Internally, people begin to ask different questions. Not how much do I have, but what can I use? What can I trade? What do I actually need right now? And this is where everything changes, because in that moment, wealth stops being abstract. It becomes immediate, functional, brutally honest. Here lies the paradox. Gold is often called a store of value, but in a real crisis, value is not something you store. It is something you consume. You don't store water, you drink it. You don't store medicine, you use it. You don't store energy, you burn it. Gold represents a promise, a future transaction, an agreement between people that something can be exchanged later. But crises do not operate on later. They operate on now, and now has no patience for promises, only for reality. This is why, in moments of true collapse, something strange happens. Value doesn't disappear. It transforms, it shifts away from symbols, toward substance, away from what represents life, toward what sustains it. A bottle of water becomes more valuable than a gold coin. A loaf of bread outweighs a stack of cash. A single dose of medicine can command more power than a vault of metal, not because these things are rare, but because they are necessary, and necessity has a different kind of authority. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't fluctuate. It demands. And this shift is not theoretical. It has happened before, many times across different countries, different systems, different cultures that never interacted yet responded in exactly the same way. When everything broke, why? Why do humans, regardless of background, revert to the same hierarchy of value under pressure? Why do the same overlooked items rise again and again, quietly overtaking gold, money, and status? And perhaps more importantly, why do people only realize this after it's too late? Maybe because in stable times, the system feels permanent. It feels reliable, predictable. Predictable, we build our lives around. Careers, investments, identities, all tied to structures we assume will continue, but systems are not. Permanent, they are temporary. Agreements. And when those agreements break, everything built on top of them begins to dissolve. Which leads to a question most people never seriously consider. If everything you rely on, your bank, your currency, your digital assets, your supply chain stopped working tomorrow, what would your wealth actually look like? Would it still exist? Would it still function? Or would it reveal itself to be something else entirely, a symbol, a belief, a fragile construct held together by trust? Because beneath every system, beneath every economy, there is a deeper layer, older, simpler, unforgiving, a layer where value is not decided by markets, but by survival. And when that layer surfaces, everything changes. This is not a story about gold losing value. It is a story about what replaces it. And the answer is far more unsettling than most people are prepared to accept. Because when the system resets, the things that matter most are not the ones we admire. They are the ones we depend on. And most people don't realize the difference until the moment it's all that matters. History doesn't warn you. It whispers, quietly, repeatedly, patiently, and most people never listen. Because history doesn't repeat events, it repeats behavior. And when systems collapse, whether through war, inflation, isolation, or slow decays, a behavior is almost identical every time. The same illusions shatter, the same patterns emerge, and the same uncomfortable truth rises to the surface. Value is never fixed. It only feels fixed. Until it to take a step back, not into theory, but into reality. Into moments where entire systems stopped working, and people were forced to rediscover what truly mattered. During the Second World War, something unexpected happened inside. Prisoner of war camps. These were places stripped of structure. No functioning government, no formal economy, no gold-backed systems, just people surviving. And yet, even in that stripped-down reality, trade didn't disappear. It evolved. Cigarettes became currency, not because they were declared as money, not because they were backed by authority, but because they fulfilled a unique combination of needs. They were divisible, portable, limited in supply, widely desired, and most importantly, trusted. Not trust in institutions, but trust in human behavior. Everyone knew someone would want them, and that was enough. Think about that for a moment. In a world where gold had dominated for centuries, in a system where entire economies were once built around precious metals, a simple cigarette burned, consumed, temporary, became more functional than gold. This is the paradox. Durability, which makes gold valuable in stable systems, becomes irrelevant in unstable ones because in crisis, people don't optimize for long-term storage. They optimize for immediate exchange, immediate use, immediate survival. Now, shift the scene. Germany. Early 1920s, the Weimar Republic, a time when money didn't disappear. It multiplied. Endlessly. Relentlessly. Banknotes were printed in such massive quantities that they lost all meaning. Prices doubled, then tripled, then surged beyond comprehension. People were paid multiple times a day just so they could rush out and spend their wages before they became worthless. Wheelbarrows full of cash, children stacking banknotes like toys, families burning money to stay warm because it was cheaper than firewood. Let that sink in. Currency still existed, but value had evaporated, and in its place, something far more primal took over. Barter. People began trading directly, food for clothing, fuel for clothing, fuel for tools, medicine for labor. The system didn't vanish. It reverted back to something older, something simpler, something brutally honest. Because when trust in currency collapses, people don't stop trading, they just stop believing, and belief is the real engine of value. Even gold, in these moments, struggled to maintain dominance, not because it lost its physical properties, but because it lost its urgency. You cannot eat gold, you cannot drink it, you cannot use it to treat illness or generate heat. And in moments where every second matters, where survival is measured in hours, not years, relevance becomes everything. Now move further. Siege conditions. Cities cut off from supply. No incoming goods, no external support. Everything that exists must come from within. In these environments, something fascinating happens. The hierarchy of value becomes visible, transparent, unavoidable. Food rises first, then water, then medicine, then energy. Everything else falls. Beneath them, jewelry becomes decoration. Wait, this is where the illusion fully dissolves. Because for the first time, people are forced to confront value without filters, without systems, without narratives, just raw need. And here lies a deeper insight across completely. Different cultures, time periods that had no connection, no shared communication, no shared knowledge. Humans responded the same way. They gravitated toward the same categories of value. Again and again and again. Why? Because beneath culture, beneath economics, beneath systems, human needs do not change. Hunger is universal. Thirst is universal. Pain is universal. Survival is universal. And when everything else is stripped away, these needs become the foundation of all value. This creates a pattern, a blueprint, one that history has already written multiple times. And yet, it is almost always ignored because in stable times, abstraction feels safe, money feels reliable, systems feel permanent. We trust that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow. But history suggests otherwise. It suggests that stability is the exception, not the rule, and that every system, no matter how advanced, carries within it the potential to fail. When that failure happens, something almost poetic occurs. Value returns to its origin, not as a concept, but as a necessity. And this is where the real question begins to form. If these patterns are so consistent, if history has shown us clearly, repeatedly, unmistakably what happens when systems collapse, why do we continue to build our lives around forms of wealth that depend entirely on those systems? Why do we prioritize symbolic value over functional value? Why do we chase accumulation while ignoring survival? Perhaps because acknowledging this truth is uncomfortable. It forces us to accept that much of what we consider wealth is conditional, temporary, dependent. It forces us to see that beneath our complex financial systems lies something much simpler and much less forgiving. A hidden mechanism, one that activates without warning, one that does not care about status, portfolios, or predictions. Only about one thing: what works and what doesn't. Because when the system disappears, only function remains, and in that moment, value becomes undeniable. But this raises another question. If value shifts this dramatically under pressure, if it transforms based on context, need, and survival, then what determines it in the first place? What invisible structure allows something like gold to dominate in one moment and become irrelevant in the next? Because this is not random, it is not chaotic, it follows a logic, a system beneath the system, and to understand it, we have to go deeper into the mechanics of value itself. Value is not what you think it is. It is not the number on a screen, not the weight of a metal, not even the price attached to an object. Value is a system, layered, invisible, fragile, and most people only see the surface. But beneath that surface, there is a structure, a hidden architecture that determines what matters and when. To understand why gold can lose to something as simple as water or medicine, you have to understand how value actually works, because value does not exist in one form, it exists in layers. The first layer is perceived value. This is the world most people live in. It is the world of brands, status, narratives, where a watch is not just a device to tell time, it is identity, a signal, a story, perceived. Value is driven by belief, not logic, not necessity. Belief, if enough people agree that something is valuable, it becomes valuable, even if it has no direct function. This is why luxury exists, why art sells for millions, why symbols carry power far beyond their physical form. But perceived value has a weakness. It depends entirely on collective agreement, and agreement can break. The second layer is systemic value. This is where money operates. Currencies, banking systems, financial markets, these are not random structures. They are engineered systems designed to stabilize value across large populations. Systemic value is backed by institutions. Governments, central banks, legal frameworks. It is reinforced by trust not just between individuals, but across entire societies. When you accept a banknote, you are not trusting the paper, you are trusting the system behind it, the promise that it can be exchanged later. This layer is more stable than perceived value, but it is still dependent because it requires infrastructure, it requires coordination, it requires continuity, and when those things are disrupted, systemic value begins to crack. Which brings us to the third layer, the one most people ignore. Survival value. This is the foundation, the layer that does not depend on belief or systems or agreements. It depends on one thing: reality. Survival value asks a single question: does this keep me alive? Not tomorrow, not next year, now, and this is where everything changes. Because in this layer, abstraction has no power, only function does. Gold thrives in the first two layers in perceived value. It symbolizes wealth, stability, history. In systemic value, it acts as a store of trust, something that governments and institutions rely on as a reserve. But in survival value, gold fails, not because it loses its properties, but because its properties become irrelevant. You cannot drink it, you cannot eat it, you cannot use it to stop bleeding or generate heat. And in a crisis, those limitations become fatal. This is the inversion point, the moment where the hierarchy flips, where the least glamorous items become the most powerful. Water, food, medicine, fuel, items that are often ignored, overlooked, taken for granted until the moment they are needed. And when that moment arrives, their value does not increase gradually. It explodes, because survival is not a spectrum, it is binary. You either have what you need, or you don't. There is no negotiation with thirst, no compromise with hunger, no delay with injury. And because of that, survival value overrides everything else. It doesn't compete with perceived or systemic value, it replaces them. This is why, in real crises, markets don't function the way we expect. Prices don't adjust smoothly. They jump, they distort, they collapse, because the underlying layer has changed, and most people are not prepared for that shift. Here lies the uncomfortable truth. Modern life trains people to optimize for the top two layers, to chase perceived value status, income, recognition. To depend on systemic value banks, currencies, digital assets. But it conditions them to ignore survival value, because in stable environments, survival feels guaranteed, invisible, automatic. You don't think about water because it's always there. You don't think about food because it's always available. You don't think about medicine because systems provide it until they don't. And when that happens, the misalignment becomes visible, painfully visible. People realize that what they own cannot meet their immediate needs, that their wealth is trapped in forms that require a functioning system to be useful. And when millions of people reach this realization at the same time, something dangerous happens. Panic doesn't spread slowly, it detonates, because panic is not just fear, it is recognition. Recognition that the rules have changed, and most people are unprepared. And in that moment, a new economy begins to form, not designed, not controlled, but instinctive. A barter system, driven not by price, but by necessity. In this system, certain items rise faster than others. Not randomly, but predictably. Items that meet immediate needs. Items that are consumable, divisible, portable. Items that intersect directly with human survival. Water becomes leverage. Food becomes currency. Medicine becomes power. Fuel becomes access. And these items begin to outperform. Gold. Not in theory, but in practice. trade after trade, decision after decision, until the old system becomes irrelevant. But here is the deeper question. If value can shift this dramatically, if it can move from abstraction to necessity in a matter of days, then what does that say about the wealth we build in stable times? How much of it is real? How much of it is dependent on conditions we cannot control? And what happens when those conditions change suddenly, simultaneously, globally? Because the modern world is not isolated, it is interconnected, deeply, and that changes everything. Because when one system fails, it doesn't fail alone. It triggers others. And when multiple layers begin to crack at the same time, the shift from perceived value to survival value is not gradual. It is immediate, violent, unforgiving, which raises one final, unsettling thought. If the true foundation of value has always been survival, and if everything else is built on top of it, then perhaps what we call wealth today is not as solid as it seems. Perhaps it is not a foundation, but a layer, a temporary one, resting on something far more primitive, far more real, and far more powerful, a layer that waits, silently, until it is needed, and when it rises, everything above it begins to fall. The modern world is not just connected, it is entangled. Every meal, every drop of fuel, every transaction depends on a chain that stretches across continents. Invisible systems coordinate everything, moving resources with precision so seamless it feels permanent, but it isn't, because the same efficiency that makes the system powerful makes it fragile. There is no buffer, only timing, and when timing breaks, everything follows. A single disruption, one port closing, one network phalanx ripple outward, emptying shelves thousands of miles away. What once felt global suddenly becomes local, immediate, personal, and this is where value begins to shift, not based on what exists somewhere in the world, but on what exists here within reach. The paradox is unsettling. The more advanced the system, the less resilient it becomes under pressure. And in that pressure, certain items detach from the global web. They don't need factories, shipping, routes, or digital systems. They simply exist and function. Which raises a deeper question: when everything depends on everything else. What still matters when everything stops?